In this lecture, you're going to learn how to update the value of a form control in a form. For that, we can use setValue method or patchValue method. So in this lecture, let's learn how to use setValue method and patchValue method and what is the difference between them. To understand setValue and patchValue, the first thing which I'm going to do is, in this form, I'm going to add one more form control called username. For that, let's go to VS Code, and here we are displaying this email field. In the same way, I also want to display a username field. So I'll copy this HTML, and after this date field, I'm going to paste that HTML. Okay, so input type is going to be text. Placeholder, let's call username. Then we also need to provide a name for this input element so that with that name, a form control will be created in the controls property of ng form. And also with that name, a property will be created in the value object. So here for the name, I'll call it as username. Okay. Then here I'm going to use this ng model directive. So for now, let's remove this two-way data binding. This field, it is going to be a required field. Now, this field is going to store a username. It is not going to store any email. So I will remove this email validator from here. And on this field also, let's provide a template reference variable. Let's call it maybe uname. And to this, we are going to assign ng model. So since we are using ng model directive here, we know that using this ng model, Angular is going to create a form control for this input element in the ng form object. Okay, so this ng model here, it is going to store a reference to that form control. And we are assigning that reference to this uname template reference variable. Now here, I don't want to use this span element, so I'll remove it from here. But I do want to show some validation error message if the username is not valid. So if the user has not provided any username in the username field, since it is a required field, we are going to show a validation error message to the user that this field is a required field. So here, let's say username is a required field. All right. Now here, instead of using this email template reference variable, we are going to use this uname template reference variable. With this, if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, you'll also see a new field called username in the form. Now after this username, I also want to display a button element. So after this div or after this input element, let's go ahead and let's add a button element. And let's say the value is create a username. Okay, and on this button element, let's add a CSS class. So to design this button, I have already written some CSS. I'm going to use this CSS class on that button. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now there you will also see a button called create a username. So when this create a username button is clicked, what we want is we want to populate this username input field with a username which will be generated dynamically. So user will have two options. Either he can enter a username by his own, or he can also click on this create a username button and it will automatically generate a username for that user. Now we want to generate a username based on the user's first name, last name, and his date of birth. So if the user has not entered a value in this first name form control or in this last name form control, or if the user has not selected any value from this date of birth field, in that case, we want to disable this create a username button, because in order to create a username, user must supply a value for first name, last name, and date of birth. Based on that only, we are going to create a username. So if these fields does not have a valid value, we are going to disable this create a username button. Otherwise, if these three fields have a valid value, then only we will enable this create a username button. Now currently this create a username button is enabled. And that's why when I click on this button, you will notice that ng form object has been logged here. Now you might say, on this button, we are not binding any click event and we are not calling any method. Right, so here on this button, we have not binded any click event. So when we are clicking on this button, how come it is logging this ng form object here? That's because by default, when we use a button inside a form, by default, that button will be of type submit. Okay, so whenever that button will be clicked, it will submit the form and it will also emit ng submit event. And we are listening for that ng submit event on this form. So here you can see we are listening for that ng submit event. And whenever the ng submit event will happen, we are calling this on form submitted method. And inside this method, we are logging that ng form object. That's why even though on this button we are not binding any click event, since when this button will be clicked, it will emit ng submit event. That's why this ng form object is being logged here. I hope it is clear. So what we are going to do is we are going to disable this button if the user has not supplied a valid value for first name, last name and date of birth field. For that, let's go to VS Code. And the first thing which we are going to do is on this date of birth field, first of all, we are going to add a required attribute because we want to make this field a required field. And then on this, we are also going to add a template reference variable. Let's call it maybe temp dob. You can name this variable anything. And to this, let's assign ng model. Now, when we assign ng model to a template reference variable, we know that this ng model, it is going to have a reference of this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So for this input element, in the controls property of ng form, a form control object will be created with this dob name. And this ng model, it is going to store a reference to that form control object. And we are assigning that reference to that form control object to this temp dob. And we already have a template reference variable on the first name. So we are calling it fname, and also on the last name. So we are going to make use of these template reference variables to disable this button element, this button here. So on this button element, we are going to add this disabled attribute, and on that we are going to do property binding. Now, when do we want to disable this button? We want to disable this button if the first name does not have a valid value, if the last name does not have a valid value, and if the date of birth does not have a valid value. So here let's say fname. So this fname is a template reference variable we are using on the first name input element, and it is going to store a reference of first name form control. On that form control, we are going to access invalid property. So if the first name has some invalid value, then we want to disable this button. Or if the last name has some invalid value, so on the last name input, we are using lname template reference variable. So if that last name form control also has some invalid value, for that we are going to use its invalid property, then also we want to disable this button. And finally, we also want to disable this button if the date of birth has some invalid value. So on this date of birth field, we are using this temp dob template reference variable. So we are going to make use of that, and this temp dob reference variable will have a reference to the form control for this date of birth input element, and we want to access its invalid property. So let's say dot invalid. Okay, so if first name input element has invalid value, or if last name element has invalid value, or this date of birth has some invalid value, in that case we want to disable the button. Otherwise, if all three of them has a valid value, then only we want to enable the button. Okay, so let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything here. So currently we have not entered any valid value in first name, last name or date of birth. So when I click on this create a username button, you will see nothing is happening. It is not logging the ng form object. That's because currently this button is disabled. If I enter a first name and then if I click on this create a username, then also it is not logging ng form object here, because again currently it is disabled, because for this last name and date of birth we do not have a valid value. So let's also enter a valid value for the last name. Again, if I click on this create a username button, again it is not logging ng form object here, because this first name and last name has a valid value, but this date of birth does not have a valid value. But if I select a valid value for the date of birth field also, now when I click on this create a username button, now you see it has logged this ng form object. So this button will be enabled only when the first name, last name and this date of birth has a valid value. And once we have a valid value for the first name, last name, and date of birth, we want allow user to generate a username. For that, let's go back to VS Code, and on this button element, so let me move this attribute also in a different line so that it will be more readable. And here on this button, let's also listen to click event. And when this click event happens, we want to call a method, maybe generate username. Okay, let's go ahead and let's create this method inside the app component class. So here, let's create that method. Now, in order to generate a username, we need the value in the first name. So for that, we have this first name property, which is going to store the value entered in the first name field. We also need the value from the last name. So this last name property is going to store the value entered in the last name field. In the same way, let's also create a property. Let's call it date of birth. Again, it is going to be of type string. Why string? Because in the web page, when the user will select a date of birth, that value will be a string value. Okay, that's why I'm creating it as a string value. And initially, let's set it to empty string. All right. And let's go ahead and let's do a two-way data binding of this date of birth property with the date of birth field. So here where we are using this ng model directive, there let's do two-way data binding. And to this ng model directive, let's assign that dob property. With this, let's save the changes. Now let's go to this app component.ts. And here, in order to calculate the username, let's first create a variable. Let's call it username. Initially, let's assign it with empty string. Then we will check if the first name, so we are going to make use of this first name property here. So if this first name, if it has a length greater than or equal to 3, then what we are going to do is we are going to get the first 3 characters from that first name. For that, let's say username plus equals, and here let's say this dot first name dot, and here I'm going to use the slice method. Okay, and to this slice method, we'll pass the starting index. So I want to get the first 3 characters. So the starting index will be 0. And since we want to get 3 characters, the second parameter will be 3. So let's say if the name is John, from that John, we want to get the first 3 characters, that is JON. Okay, so here, this line, it will return the first 3 characters from the first name, and we are assigning it to the username. But if the first name length is less than 3, that means if it is 2 or 1, in that case, let's also write an else statement. And there, let's say username plus equals this dot first name. Okay. Let's do the same thing for last name. So if the user has provided last name, from that last name also, we want to get the first 3 characters if the length of the last name is greater than or equal to 3. Otherwise, if the length of last name is less than 3, in that case, we want to append that last name to this username. So here also it should be last name. Okay, but if the first name does not have a length greater than or equal to 3, in that case, it will get the complete first name. And if the last name does not have a length greater than or equal to 3, it will get the complete last name and it will append it to this username. So here we are getting the first 3 characters from the first name and first 3 characters from the last name. Finally, we also want to get the year from the date of birth field, and we want to append that year to the username. So for that, let's create a variable. Let's call it birth year. Okay. And here we are going to create a new instance of date object. And to this, to the constructor of this date object, we are going to pass the date of birth, which we are going to receive for this date of birth property. So whatever date of birth user will select in the UI, that will be assigned to this date of birth property, this DOB property, and it will be a string value. And we are going to pass that string value to this date object. And based on that string value, this date object will return us a date type. Okay, so it is going to return us a date time. So instead of calling it birth here, let me call it date time. And from this date time, I want to get the year. For that, I can say datetime dot get full year. So this will return us the year part from the datetime. And we are going to append that year to the username. So here, let's say username plus equals, and we are going to append the year from that date of birth. And finally, let's convert this username to lowercase. So for that, let's say username dot to lowercase. And let's go ahead and let's log this username in the console. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me clear everything here. So initially this button will be disabled, but if we enter a valid name for the first name, last name, and date of birth, and when I click on this create a username, you will see that it has created a username here and it has been logged here. But here it has not converted it all to lowercase. That's because after converting this username to lowercase, we also need to assign it back to this username. Let's save the changes now. Let's go back to the web page. Let me select the first name, last name, and a date of birth. And when I click on this create a username, now you will see that a username has been created and it is all in lowercase. Now we want to populate this username field with the generated username. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go back to VS Code and let's first try to access the value property of ngForm object, and using that value property, let's try to update the username. So we are storing ngForm object in this form property. So let's first access that form property. For that, here let's say this dot form, and this form is going to return us an instance of ngForm. That ngForm will have a value property, and in that value property, a property called username will be created, because here we are creating an input element where the name is username. So with this name, a property will be created in the value object, and we want to access that username property, and here we want to set its value to this username which we are calculating here. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's see if it works. So let's say first name is Manoj, last name is Jha, and let's select a date of birth. Let's click on this create a username button. You see the username has been calculated. We can see it here, but it has not populated that username field with that username value. But here, after assigning this username property with the username value, if I go ahead and if I log it, so let me log this expression here. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let's select first name. Let's select last name. Let's select a date of birth. And let's click on this create a username button. So you see at line number 62, it is logging that username. So that means we are logging that username at this line. So that means this username has been assigned with the value which we are trying to assign it here. But for some reason, it is not updating this input field here. Now, why is that? That's because here we are trying to update a property of this value object. Okay, so we are trying to update this username property of this value object. So it will update it here. As you can see, it has updated it here. But it is not going to populate that value in this form control, because this username here, it is a property of this value object. It is not a form control. Okay. Now let's try it in another way. So here, instead of using the value property, let's try to access the form control of the username, and then let's try to update its value. For that, we can use this controls property. And when we are using the controls property, we cannot use the dot notation. There we will have to use square bracket notation. And this username, it should be a string value in that case. And on that, let's try to access value property and let's try to update its value. Okay, now here you will notice that we have an error. And when I hover over this error, it says cannot assign to value because it is a read-only property. Okay, so the value here, it is read-only property. We cannot assign it a value directly. So how can we update a value in a form control? For that, we can use setValue method or patchValue method. Okay, so let me remove these two lines of code, or I'll comment it for your reference. And now let's talk about setValue method. So the setValue method is used to update a form control, form group, or form array. And when we use setValue method, we pass an object to the setValue method to update the value of a form control, form group, or form array. And the structure of the object that we are passing to this setValue method, that must match the structure of the form control, form group, or form array which we are trying to update. Let's try to understand this with an example. So here, let's try to access this dot form, and this form property here, it is storing an instance of this ng form. On that, let's call setValue. So here, using the setValue method, we are trying to update a form. Now, when we are trying to update a form here, to this setValue, we need to pass an object, and the structure of that object must match. So let me enter first name, last name, and date of birth here. So here we have an error. This error is because this setValue method, it is expecting an object with some properties. Now, for now, let me comment this line here. Okay, and let's go back again. And again, let me enter first name, last name, and a date of birth. And when I click on this create username, this ng form object has been logged. Here we have this value object. So the object which we are going to pass to the setValue method, the structure of that object must match the structure of this object which is assigned to this value property. So there we need to have all these properties. We also need to have this address property, and this address property should be an object, and in that object we should have these properties. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's provide this structure to this setValue. So let me uncomment it, and in this object we want to have a first name property, and this first name property, let's assign it with empty string for now. In the same way, let's also have a last name property to this also. Let's assign empty string for now. Let's remove this keyword. Then we also have an email property there, and to this email property also let's assign empty string. Then there we also have this phone property. Let's assign it with empty string. We have dob property. Again, let's assign it with empty string. Then we also have address property, which is again going to be an object because this address property is a form group. And in that address property, we have street1. So a property called street1. For now, let's assign it with the value empty string. We have a property called street2. There also, let's assign it with the value empty string. Then let's go back to the web page. So we also have a country and city property. Initially, let's assign it with empty string. We have city property, that also let's assign it with empty string. Then we have a region property. Again, let's set it to empty string. And we have postal property, and let's assign it to empty string. Okay, and here first name, email, phone, dob, and we also have username property now because we have created a new field called username. And this username property we want to update with this username value which we are calculating. So let's assign that username here. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now let me enter a first name, last name, and let's enter some email. And I'll simply enter a date of birth. And now let's click on this create a username. So here we have a error. It says must supply a value for form with the name last name. Okay, this n should be in lowercase. Okay, let's go back again. Let's see if we have any other errors. And let me select a date of birth. Now it says must supply a value for form control with name gender. We have not supplied a gender property here. So let's also add that gender property, and let's say it should be male. Okay, I'm simply assigning some default values here. Later we will see how we can get the value from the form control and keep that value itself. Let's go back. Let's again select first name, last name, a date of birth, and let's click on this create a username. So you see, now this username field has been populated with the calculated username. But after that, this first name, last name has become empty, and other fields are also empty, and the gender selected is male. That's because when we are updating the value of the form controls, there for the first name, last name, and other fields, we are passing empty string. So even though the username has been calculated and that username control has been populated with the proper username, other fields have become empty. Now, how to solve this problem? To solve this problem, again, we are going to make use of this form property. So this form is of type ng form. So here, what we are going to do is we are going to say this dot form dot value dot, and from that value object, we want to read the value of first name. So here, let's say first name. Okay, let's do the same thing for other fields as well. Here we want to read the value of last name. Here we want to read the value of email. Here we want to read the value of phone property. Here we want to read the value of date of birth property. And here we want to read the value of gender property. Okay, we want to update the username with the username which we have calculated here. Rest other things, we want to keep the value which the user has entered previously. So here we want to read the value of street1 property and we want to assign it to this street1 property of this object. Here we want to read the value of street2. Here we want to read the value of country property. Then here we want to read the value of city property. Here we want to read the value of region property. And here we want to read the value of postal property. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page and let's try it one more time. So let's provide first name, let's provide last name, let's provide email. Okay, and let's select our date of birth. And let's click on this create a username button. So now you see, now these values are not getting removed and the username is also generated. Okay, so based on the first name, last name, and date of birth, a username has been generated. Now here we have this error and it says must supply a value for form control with name street1. That's because here this street1, it is not present on this value property. Instead, in this value property, we will have an address property, and in that address property, we will have this street1 property. So this address property, it is going to be an object, and in that object, we will have this street1 property because this address is a form group. So let's do the same thing for other properties here because all these properties are available inside the address object. It is not available inside the value object. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's see if we still get that error. So I'll set the first name, last name, and let's select a date of birth. And now when I click on this create a username, we don't have that error anymore. All right. So when we are using this setValue method, to that setValue method, we need to pass an object, and that object structure must match the structure of this value object. Okay. So you see here, we only want to update one field, this username field. But to update this username field, we need to provide the complete object, right? So here, instead of using setValue method, what we can also do is we can use patchValue method. So let me comment this line here. And now let's use patchValue method. So again, on this form property. So this form property is going to return us an instance of ng form. On that, we are going to have another property called form. And in this form, we have a method called patchValue. To this patchValue also, we need to pass an object. But in this object, we only need to specify that field which we want to update. Here, we only want to update the username field. And to this username field, we want to assign the value which we have calculated for this username variable. So if I save the changes, if I go to the web page, let's select first name, let's select last name, let's select a date of birth, and let's click on this create a username button. And you will notice that that username field has been populated with the automatically generated username. So using patchValue is as simple as that. Now, let's say if you want to update a property from a form group. So if I expand this value field here, let's say if you want to update this country field, in that case, you need to access it something like this. So first, you need to specify the form group name, which is address in this case, and you need to specify an object because in the value object, we have a property called address, and in that address object only, we have a property called country, right? And let's say we want to assign this country with the value, maybe Japan. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let me select first name. Let me select last name. Let's select a date of birth. Currently, the country selected is India, but when I click on this create a username, you will notice that the country selected is now Japan. So when you want to access a property from a form group, you need to use it something like this. So as I mentioned, in the value object, we have this address property, and in that address property only, we have this country property. So if we want to update the country property using patchValue method, we need to access it like this. So first we need to create this address property, which is an object. In that address property, we have this country property, and we can set its value. So this is how we can use patchValue method. When we use setValue method, there when we pass an object, that object structure must match the structure of the value object. But when we use patchValue method, there we only need to specify the structure of the property which we want to update. I hope it is clear. So the patchValue method is used to update only a subset of the element of form group or form array. And it will only update the matching objects and ignore the rest other properties.